Okay, good afternoon. My name is Julia Coakley, Head of Operations, and on behalf of the MGAA, I'd like to welcome you to our webinar this afternoon, which is being delivered by Implement Compliance Solutions and Resources, ICSR. Before I introduce our presenter, I ask that during this webinar, you ensure your camera phone and your microphone is off. If you'd like to ask a question, please use the chat button at the bottom of your screen, which will be answered at the end of the presentation during the Q&A session. If we run out of time and don't have an opportunity to put your question to our speaker, this will be responded to at the end of the event. We will be inviting responses to some poll questions during the webinar. These answers will remain anonymous. And the presentation is accredited for CPD points if relevant to your ongoing professional development. The video will be available on our website and uploaded to our YouTube channel. And finally, please take time to respond to our feedback survey, which will be issued after this webinar, as this will enable us to deliver the best quality events to our membership. So today's webinar, Appointed Representatives Managing the Regulatory Risks for MGAs, is being delivered by ICSR, and I'd like to introduce Kenneth Underhill, Director. Kenneth has over 25 years in the London insurance market experience and is the former General Counsel of Chubb Europe, then ACE. He was responsible for legal, compliance and corporate governance across the EMEA region. Prior to that, Kenneth was a founding partner of the commercial and regulatory team at Reynolds Porter Chamberlain. He is the founding director of ICSR and alongside his own advisory work, manages ICSR's talent pool of consultants. So Kenneth, if I might hand over to you.
Thank you very much, Julia. Right, let's get this screen up. We've got quite a lot to get through. I think I've set myself a bit of a task today. Let's get going. Hang on. Oh, there we go. All right, so welcome everybody. Let's crack on. Right, so we've done the welcomes. We're going to start with a poll question, which we hope you will all respond to. And we're going to start by finding out whether or not you are an appointed representative or whether you are a firm that is a principal of appointed representatives. We're expecting a mixture, but we are expecting more principals than appointed reps. So let's see where we get to. We will give it a little bit longer. We've got almost 100 responses already. Getting there. Whoop, there we go. We're over 100. So we've got about 80%. I'm going to give you a couple more seconds. Let's see. 5 more seconds if you want to answer this one. All right, well, let's end that now and we will look at the results. Right, okay, so the results. Look at that, 80% of you are principals, which shouldn't be a surprise given that this is something that's been organised by the MGAA. If we can now move on, I'm going to get that off my screen and let's start. We've got an issue again. This happens every time we do polls. We can't move on to the next slide. Come on. All right, I'm going to have to stop sharing and start again. Sorry, everyone. I don't know why this happens. It happens. Right, let's see if we can move on this time. Right, okay, here we go. So simply, we're going to start at the beginning. What is the scheme, the regime, the appointed representatives regime? So in the UK, if you want to undertake regulated activities, whether as a broker or an insurer or an MGA, you have to be authorised, or you can be exempt. And there are very few exemptions. One of those is under Section 39 of the Financial Services Markets Act, and that exemption is what's called the Appointed Representatives regime. So an authorised firm, such as an MGA, can agree that somebody else via a contract can undertake regulated activities and the circumstances in which they can do that. There must be a contract and the principal, that is the MGA or the insurer or the broker, has to have accepted responsibility for the activities of the third party, which is the appointed representative. The other key piece about this is that the principal can only agree with the appointed representative that they may undertake regulated activities which that principal has authority for. The AR, however, remains outside of the regulatory perimeter. That is, they are not authorised. Let's move to the next slide. In order for this to happen, there are 4 real phases to the life cycle of an appointed representative arrangement. The first is that before you get to appoint and approve an authorised representative, the principal has to do 2 things. Well, it has to do 3 things, really. The first one is they have to ensure and they have to make a decision that the appointment will not prevent them from meeting threshold conditions 2.4 regarding the resources of the principal. They also have to be able to demonstrate that at the point that they are intending to appoint the appointed representative, they have the controls and the resources to monitor the appointed representative. So those are the first 2 things they have to do. They must ensure that they document each of those. So they have to document the decision that this is not going to affect their threshold condition compliance, and they have to be comfortable that they have the right controls and resources in place. Then the additional thing that they have to do is that they have to undertake some due diligence. And the areas that they've got to look at are solvency of the appointed representative, the suitability of the appointed representative, ensure that there are no close links for the appointed representative, and they have to make sure that the insurance distribution activity contact, that is the IDD individual who is going to be responsible and dealing with customers, is of good repute and has the minimum necessary knowledge. Now, again, that's the due diligence that has to be undertaken. It's key that these are documented. And the issue here, so the reason that you've got to do this due diligence piece is if you compare the arrangement of an appointed representative with, say, delegation of underwriting under a binder, there's very little difference. And, you know, under an appointed representative regime, you can write business if that's the authority that's being given to you. You can place risks if that's the authority being given to you. You can service the business. And so there's very little difference between a binder and an appointed representative regime, except for one key factor. And that key factor is that the appointed representative is not inside the regulatory perimeter, whereas insurers tend not to grant binding authorities to firms that are not actually authorised and regulated. And the issue around that is why the regime requires the principal to be responsible for the activities of the appointed representative, because that firm is outside the regulatory perimeter. That's the only real difference. And what I'm going to say at the moment is that we often see that the principal may have made the decision that the appointment is not going to impact threshold conditions, but it's rarely ever documented appropriately. And it's also rarely documented at the same time that the controls and resources exist to monitor the appointed representatives. All right, let's move on to the next part of the life cycle. So the appointment, I've already mentioned that it has to be under a contract. So that contract must specify the regulated activities which have to be performed or can be performed by the appointed representative. And again, those regulated activities, the placing of risks, the underwriting of risks, the servicing, the handling of claims, all of that, you can only undertake those under that contract if the principal has the authority and can grant that authority to you. Importantly, the contract has to say that the appointed representative will comply with FCA requirements. It must confirm that the principal is responsible. It also requires the appointed representative to confirm that it will not act or not undertake any of those activities unless or until it is registered on the Financial Services Register. Now, quite often we find that that isn't being complied with, and it's actually key that it is complied with, because if an appointed representative starts acting before they are registered, then essentially the principal is trading with an unauthorized entity, which of course itself is a breach. Now, I guess one thing to point out here is that I've said that it's key, but we all know, or many of you who have applied recently for authorization or registration of appointed representatives are finding that the FCA is taking an awful long time to deal with those applications. We've heard of instances where the registration is taking months, not days or weeks. And that, of course, slows down business. I think, and we'll come to it later on, but I think that that is going to continue and is unlikely to change for some time, if not get worse. The contract also has to sort of mandate that the appointed representative will cooperate with the FCA, and if there are multiple principals, there are requirements for division of responsibilities within the contract. Right. During agency, these are the things that have to happen. All of these are written requirements from the FCA. Some are specific requirements and are contained in the handbook, and others are expressed written requirements which the FCA has outlined in previous documentation, some of which can be easily found on the website, some of which is not so easy to find on the website. But if we look, when you are monitoring an AR, when a principal is monitoring an AR, they have to check that competence remains, that the company continues, or the AR continues to be financially stable. They have to check that the AR is meeting FCA requirements, has PI cover, has the appropriate governance structure and systems and controls, the right individuals have the right skills, and that sound advice is being offered. Now, our experience, and I'm afraid to say that it's also, from what we are hearing now, the FCA's experience, is that the monitoring is not up to the standards that we would expect, and certainly the FCA, has expressed concern about the monitoring activities and described it as at best poor quality. In some cases, the monitoring that we see, the governance structure isn't looked at, systems and controls aren't reviewed, and certainly aren't looked at to make sure that they are actually effective. We've seen cases where monitoring has involved the principal saying, yes, they've got the compliance policies they need, that's fine. But actually, that's just the start. If you don't have the right systems and the right controls in place, and they're not in writing and they're not being operated and complied with, then there's a very strong chance that the firm isn't going to be meeting the FCA's requirements. Okay, so the other important point is in relation to the reporting by the principal to the FCA on its monitoring activity. You also have to make sure that the AR registration is maintained and up to date, and the same for the IDA contacts and any governing functions. Now, if we look at the monitoring activities. The reporting activities from the FCA. The key about these issues, so these are the areas that everybody has to report, the principals have to report under the RMAR, Section H rather, to the FCA. These already exist, they are ongoing reporting requirements, but the key piece for everyone to understand is that the FCA doesn't just look at this on a macro point, on a micro point of view. Is this firm doing what it should do? What it has done is, over the time of the RMAR and the reporting requirements, it has been collating this data, it's put it all together, it's analysed it at a macro level, it has identified what it considers to be key risk indicators, and it has done benchmarking standards. So it already is able to look at a firm and determine whether or not it thinks that principal is doing enough in terms of monitoring. Even without turning up at your offices or asking any additional questions, it's got its own idea about where you are in the scale of monitoring activities. Some of these things, like the question of whether the firm has systems and procedures to ensure that the activities of its ARs are effectively monitored. That, as I said earlier on, is something that you have to do and make sure is in place before you even appoint the AR. So, you know, the ongoing monitoring is checking all phases of that life cycle. All right, we're going to come up with the next poll question, which probably means I won't be able to move on, but let's start with that. Okay, here we go. Could you please let us know what you think are the key issues causing most regulatory complexity with ARs? Okay. I'm going to give this about a minute, I think, because there's quite a lot of options there. And while that's going on, while you're all looking at that, the key point about each of these issues is that they're almost all new, or they're all a key focus for the FCA at the moment. For example, financial crime, money laundering, since COVID-19 has been something that they have been looking at very carefully. And the FCA would expect that you as the principal, or the MGAs who are principals, to make sure that your ARs are up to date with all of these activities, is aware of the FCA requirements, and is doing what's required. Okay, so we've got 110, about 110 people have answered that. So I think we can stop that now and share it. There you go. General management of the regulatory relationship between the AR and the principal is the area that most people seem to be concerned with, 56%. Second in line is distribution chains and fair value. I'm not surprised by that at all, particularly because, you know, the AR is distributing products more often than not, and fair value is the thing that everybody is grappling with at the moment. So there's no surprise in any of those. My key message, as I've said, is that, you know, principals need to make sure that ARs are up to date and complying with these requirements as much as anybody else is. Okay, so let's see what happens if I try and move on. I'm trying to get rid of that. Right, okay, that's gone. All right. We're stuck again on this page, so I'm going to have to just close out of this. If I can, stop sharing, start again. I don't know why this does that. It's a sort of technical issue here. Right, let's try again. No, I don't know what's going on. Sorry, everyone. Let's have another go. No, we are stuck. All right, hang on. Apologies to everyone.
Kenneth, if it doesn't work this time, I can share the slide deck.
All right, let's just see. Oh, it's gone all the way back. Okay, is that where we're up to? So what are the risks? Well, the key issue, obviously, is what the FCA thinks. And the FCA is concerned about risk of harm to customers. From an MGA's point of view, the risks are if you fail to undertake appropriate due diligence or you're trading with an unregistered AR or an unregistered IDA or failing to monitor appropriately, these can lead to breaches of the FCA requirements, poor underwriting results, unhappy customers, poor customer outcomes can lead to fines, remediation, restrictions on permissions, a variation of permission, for example, loss of capacity. If you're suffering from poor underwriting results, your capacity may withdraw the binders, and of course, loss of reputation. If you're an appointed representative and you fail to comply with the FCA requirements, then the obvious response from an MGA would be to withdraw the agreement that allows you to carry on. So those are the key risks. Let's now look. We're getting into the nitty-gritty bit stuff now, really. So the FCA plans, what are the issues? Well, the key issue for the FCA, well, these are key issues, all of them, but the diversity of the business model is an issue because the AR regime can be used by anybody. It's not just an insurance thing. It's also used in the wider financial services. You can see it, for example, in mortgage advice, although there have been some restrictions on that in the last few years. But you have small firms who use it for a small number of ARs. You even have small firms who have quite a number of ARs. You have established principals that have networks, for example. So they may have tens or hundreds of ARs. And from an AR's perspective, the diversity starts with startups. There are people who are not necessarily actually within the sort of financial services sector who are doing financial services activities. There are firms which are more akin to mortgage broking or to banking who are ARs and distributing insurance products. There are mobile phone operators who are appointed representatives. There are violin manufacturers. So the range of firms that are principals and appointed representatives is vast. And that causes problems because it's difficult to know whether or not the approach that's being adopted is sufficiently robust, I guess. And that leads to the second one, which is the lack of FCA line of sight. They feel that they aren't getting enough information. They have, obviously, they received the reports through the RMAR, but they don't get a lot of information at the time that the AR is registered. They get some information, but it's not the sort of information they get on an application for authorization. And it's just not giving them a real feel for the level of risk that firms are taking when appointing ARs and whether or not and I think they're fairly clear about the fact that they're not happy with the level of oversight. The last two of these, historical failings, high potential for poor customer outcomes, both of these come from diagnostic work that they have already carried out and been carrying out since before 2018. And that is what's leading to where we are now. So where are we now? Okay, so the FCA has issued two plans, or a plan and a report this year, the FCA business plan, and more recently, their perimeter report. And I want to give you a bit of background before we look briefly at these. So recently, there was something called the LCF scandal. I'm sure that many of you heard about it. In that particular case, thousands of customers lost millions of pounds in investments by investing in unregulated bonds, which were sold by an entity. And that entity was operating an unregulated business. It was outside of the perimeter, and that was considered to be unacceptable. There were real questions about how that particular arrangement could be unregulated, and it has driven much closer examination of the perimeter and what is regulated and what isn't regulated. So the background there is that there have been thousands of customers who've lost millions in investments, and the result is, are we comfortable that that's where the perimeter should sit? The FCA took a bit of a battering from the Treasury, from the government, over whether or not it was doing a good enough job. And then, while that battering was taking place, COVID-19 came along. And in general, the regulators are not comfortable and are not happy that the insurance industry did a very good job during COVID-19. So in all previous significant issues, market issues, 2008, the banking crisis, the financial crisis, the insurers generally were stable. There were one or two issues. AIG had a problem because it had an endemic issue central to its core, but in general, a lot of insurers were fairly stable and customers were looked after during that. So in previous big market or world issues, the insurance industry has not done badly. And along comes COVID-19, and for the first time, there's a real focus on insurers and a focus on making sure that customers get the service that they believe that they have paid for. And the feeling is that the industry should have paid a lot more claims than it had and should have dealt with them quickly, and that the FCA shouldn't have been required to bring legal proceedings. Now, at the same time that all of that was happening, in comes a new CEO. So Nicol Rathie was appointed last year. The Treasury is giving the FCA a hard time. So Nicol is given the job of sorting this out. So his first business plan comes out, and guess what? He's not going to say, we're going to relax and make it easier. No, he comes out and he does exactly what you'd expect. He says, we're going to be more assertive. We're going to be more proactive at the perimeter boundaries. We've already identified many firms that have been poor with their due diligence and poor on their oversight. So we're going to look to improve that. And we're going to consult on more fundamental changes. Now, those fundamental changes can only relate to the legislation itself, okay? What should and shouldn't be inside or outside of the perimeter? Okay, so we're going to come back to that because we'll look at that in a moment. But at the same time, 6 months later or so, we get the perimeter report. So they've had a look at what they can do around the perimeter. The perimeter report covers financial services generally, but they have a specific section on ARs. And the report comes up with a statement that there are significant shortcomings in principles, understanding and compliance with FCA requirements around oversight and controls. Okay. They have decided that they're going to have more targeted and more proactive supervision. Again, this is Nickel. It's his job to make sure that customers get good outcomes. And it's not surprising that this is what he's doing in view of the bigger picture. What they do, which is interesting, is that they have decided that they are going to have greater intensity on their scrutiny of principals and applicants, and that having undertaken a small pilot scheme, there was a 50% reduction in applications that were approved. Many applications were withdrawn. So that, to me, points quite clearly to a potential area that they're heading to. And they're going to consult on proposals to address identified harm and how to reduce the opportunities for misuse of the regime. And I will come back to that question of misuse, because they have made some comments about what they consider to be misuse. Right, so the FCA's plans. What are the possibilities? Okay, so increased due diligence requirements. I'm afraid to say I think that's obvious. They've already made the statement that they think that that due diligence isn't being done properly. I'm sure there are many firms out there who have large networks of ARs and they work very hard at it. But there are some others who possibly the AR model is not core to their business and may not be giving it the same level of attention. Applications are going to be more complex, so they're obviously going to take forward that pilot scheme that they've operated, which means that there will be, firstly, slower. Applications will be slower. Secondly, there are likely to be less approved, and it will take longer. General personal responsibility under SMCR for principals and AR employees. I personally think that already exists. It just hasn't been used by the FCA as a tool to improve things. So my view is that that's unlikely to be an area that they're going to really work hard on, although they could, of course, roll out the certification regime in more detail. Greater control and oversight requirements. So at the moment, their expectations around control and oversight are just that. Many of their requirements are not actually formalized in the handbook. Many of them are through the sort of documents that they issue where they're identifying expectations. They may be Dear CEO letters and the likes. I would expect they will formalize those and they will increase the requirements for control and oversight. There could be restrictions on businesses which may be ARs. So they may conclude that they will only grant AR status to individuals and firms who actually operate in that sector. And that could cause problems. If you are a mobile phone operator selling mobile phone insurance, and suddenly, you're not able to do that, you're going to have to get yourself authorized. But that, frankly, could be exactly what the FCA is looking for. And it's certainly in line with what they have been suggesting. So there may be restrictions on activities which ARs may perform. There may be time constraints. So the time constraints thing is interesting because the AR arrangements, one of the reasons for setting up the AR arrangements was to allow small firms, startup firms who didn't pose a great deal of risk to get themselves going so that they can then apply. But now there are some quite mature firms that have been ARs for a long time and they like being an AR because for them, they see it as being less expensive than being authorized. That has its own real issues and questions around the dynamics. How can it be less expensive to comply with something which, if you are authorized, you have to comply with? Well, the question there can only be around the difference in cost between the FCA fees for being authorized and the fees that they pay their principals. So the key issue here, which I haven't put in here, is that what they could do is expect more firms to move into inside the perimeter. So either the restrictions or time constraints, through either of these, they could be pushing for firms, mature firms, and specific activities to be no longer capable of being subject to the appointed representatives regime. Now, I mentioned earlier the point about misuse of the regime. So there are quite a few firms who have used this scheme, the regime, the appointed representatives regime, as a way or as a part of their Brexit solution. So rather than going into the TPR and rather than then applying for authorization for their European entity, they've used the appointed representative regime. Our firm informed clients who were thinking about what to do about Brexit that this existed, but our view was that because of the focus on perimeter, the regulatory perimeter, and the FCA's concerns about the appointed representative regime, doing so was a risk. And we have certainly heard that the FCA are not happy about the use of the regime as a tool to solve Brexit. So I'm not saying that they're going to change that, but we do know that they consider that it is entering the UK via the back door rather than coming through the front door. So it is open to the FCA to restrict appointed representatives to being UK entities. So we're all going to have to watch that space, I think. Right, we're going to move on to the next poll. And Julia, if we do have problems, I will ask you to take over the slides. There is only one more slide to go. But could you please all fill in this one or answer this one? And there's a very... Oh, wow, okay. So it's a simple one. Lots of firms that we have worked with on appointed representatives have documents that say there's a policy and we will do X and Y and Z, but it's not a fully documented framework which covers the life cycle. And that for us is a concern because we think that firms are missing that first phase of making sure that they're checking their own threshold conditions, making sure that they have in place their own framework for dealing with appointed representatives. And that is a documented regulatory requirement. All right. We are, where are we? We're still below. Okay, we'll give it a couple more seconds. All right, I think we can stop that one, Julia, and publish. There you go. So that may be a part of the answer to why why the FCA are still looking at or are looking at ARs, because 40% of the firms who are on this call don't have a framework. And it really is a core part of your approach to ensuring that you have your own controls would be to have the right framework in place. Okay, can we move on? Can we get rid of that, please? Right, let's see if this is going to work. No, Julia, are you able to take over or shall I go back to doing what I usually do?
I certainly can. Bear with me just a moment.
Okay, there's only one more slide to go. Apologies to everyone. I've got to stop sharing, haven't I?
Yeah, if you stop sharing, please, Kenneth. Thank you.
There we go.
Okay, let me know if you can see my...
Yep. Okay, go down to slide 15, please. Right.
Yeah.
I thought I'd set myself too much of a task to get through it all, but we're there. So what can firms do now to prepare for the changes? Because there are going to be changes. There is also likely to be some further diagnostic work from the FCA. So the FCA has already said that it's going to increase its scrutiny, and we expect that that will be ongoing. I think that firms should be thinking about that now. The first one that they should be thinking about is reviewing or improving due diligence processes, checking that they really are up to date and covering everything that the FCA wants them to. They need to go back, principals need to go back and ensure that there is documentation of the decisions and that they are up to date, because you need to maintain those. You need potentially to review and improve your oversight frameworks, your monitoring, your audit processes. We've seen, examples of firms principals going to the AR's offices and sitting down for half an hour or an hour or two and having a chat with them about what they're doing and calling that an audit. I think there really does need to be an improvement in the oversight piece. Appointed representatives are required to meet FCA requirements, and one of the best ways of ensuring that they actually know what they need to be doing is to involve them in training. So principals could use a separate training scheme, or they could include their ARs in their own training schemes. Another thing that can be done is to use the compliance function to engage with the ARs, particularly around horizon scanning and regulatory change issues. We've already identified some of those earlier. The firms were concerned more about the relationship with the AR than they were with whether or not some of those changes were being dealt with. I think that needs a little bit of look, just judging by the responses from everybody. And you need to check your contractual arrangements. In cases where the contracts have been in place for some time, you need to go back and look at those, because the contractual requirements have been upgraded by the FCA in recent years. You need to make sure that your contracts are meeting their requirements. These are all, as I have said previously, these are all things which firms are expected to be doing now. Our experience and what the FCA is saying to everybody is, this needs to be upgraded. And I think that's true. I think there's work to be done by a number of firms. Not everybody, but certainly some. All right, that's the end. We now get to go to questions. And next slide. Right, who's giving me questions? Ben, Julia, who's got the questions today?
Yeah, I can give you those. Thanks.
Okay.
So our first question, and thank you for that. Our first question, does the IDA contact have to be from the AR, or can they be from the principal?
Well, that's a good question. Well, the idea, it depends on who is having the contact with the customers, right? So if the individual who's having the interaction with the customer, so for example, let's think the AR is got authorization from the principal to bind the business, but actually the distribution and the contact with the customer is through the principal, say the servicing department of the principal, so that the AR has outsourced to the principal the servicing or the provision of IT or the, the claims handling or whatever, then it could be somebody within the principal. It doesn't have to be somebody in the AR if they aren't actually undertaking an activity which, connects with customers. Okay, good question.
Thank you. Next question. Do you see what you have outlined as also affecting principles of introducer appointed representatives?
Well, that's a very good question. We weren't looking at ARs, but I think that they are looking at the entirety of the perimeter. They've certainly focused on appointed representatives, but it wouldn't surprise me if they did think about IARs as well. Yeah, I think that's a fair call.
Thanks, Kenneth. When checking the FCA register for the AR permissions, the website refers to contact the principal. Is there a way to find out on the FCA website? Can we assume the AR permissions are the same as the principals?
No. No, and the reason for that is that it doesn't specify, I think, on the Financial Services Register what permissions the AR has, as far as I can recall. I think that you have to ask the principal what they have contracted with the AR to do. I think that's right. I could check that now, but in fact, I will check it afterwards. But I'm pretty sure that the register doesn't outline all of the AR's authorised activities or regulated activities.
If I could just note there, I've got these questions from Teresa. So Teresa, who's obviously on the call, if she could just note who that question was from, and then we can go back to them post-event and just provide the definitive answer.
Okay.
Another question, as a principal, if there is a dormant AR, is there anything we should be doing in the background to ensure compliance?
Well, that's a good question. Well, according to the FCA, and I think this is reasonably good. If
fair enough. So no, I'm not asking this. Don't worry, I'm on the FCA call.
If an appointed representative is not using its permissions, or even a principal is not using their permissions, they're supposed to hand them back. I would think, from a practical point of view, that if you have a dormant AR, then you should be withdrawing the agreement, because you have, as a principal, you have a risk there, and if you're not checking that they're not using their approved activities, or then you don't know what they're doing. So I would have thought that the thing to do there would be to remove any agreement that you have with that AR if they're not using them, just to reduce your own risk.
Thank you, Kenneth. Is there likely to be any differentiation between one-man band ARs and full service firms as ARs?
Well, I mean, there is supposed to be differentiation, and that is around proportionality. But you know, if you have a large AR which is dealing only with large commercial customers, and a small single AR which is dealing with consumers, I'm pretty sure I know which one the FCA would be more concerned about. So there should be proportionality, but the fact is that the principal is responsible for the activities of its AR. So it needs to make sure that it's comfortable that the AR is doing what it should be doing.
Yeah. Another question. It was mentioned that an AR must have no close links to the principal. Please could you expand on what close links mean?
Ownership. So close links, the rules are set out on the FCA website, but I think is it 25% or 10%? There's a limit to the amount of ownership that a party can have before they have close links. And I'm afraid I can't remember what the percentages are. It may be 10%.
Okay, thank you. Kenneth, you mentioned ARPI, professional indemnity, early on. Could you confirm there is no FCA requirement for the AR to have PI, but the principal firm must ensure its own policy covers ARs?
Well, I mean, when everybody gets the slides, which will be available shortly after this, you will see that is under monitoring, and that is an FCA expectation is that the PI would have, that the AR will have PI. Now, whether the AR has PI under the principal's policy or not is a different matter. But it's very difficult to see how if an AR isn't covered by PI, it's very difficult to see how a principal could consider that that AR was financially secure and that it was appropriate to appoint them. So obviously what a principal could do is to cover them under their own PI policy. But if they don't, then I would think that the principal should be making sure that the AR does have PI cover.
Thank you. Do you feel that the FCA will restrict timescale on how long an AR can be an AR and make compulsory for authorisation in its own right?
I don't have a feel for that, I'm afraid. I think it's a possibility. From the point of view of the FCA, the appointed representative scheme was for small firms. If you are no longer a small firm, no longer a very small firm, and are actually an established business and have been trading as an AR for a long time, it's something they could do. You know, I mean, the point is the FCA wants to increase the size of the perimeter in order to bring firms into it, which currently aren't. I don't know if actually that's probably the wrong way of putting it. I think the FCA wants to make sure that customers are protected. And if that means requiring more people to be regulated, then that's what they will do. And that is just one of the ways that they could do it.
Thanks, Ken. We won't hold you to that. You mentioned that an appointed representative sits outside the regulatory framework and is not authorised. Does that mean that they may not enter into a terms of business agreement with an insurer provider in their own right? That agreements have to be signed by the principal? No, that's not right. An AR has the ability to trade with any regulated entity and can enter into agreements with regulated entities. The question really there is one of practice, which is, are insurers prepared to enter into contractual relationships with ARs? And many of them don't or won't, which is why TOBAs are generally put in place with the principal. And certainly that's even more the case, or even more so, with binding authorities. Most insurers aren't going to grant a binding authority to an AR. And I can't remember, but I think that's actually a Lloyd's requirement, although that may have changed recently. But historically, a lot of insurers aren't prepared to grant a binder to an AR. And the consequence is that the binder gets granted to the principal. Thank you, Kenneth. For the time being, that's it for the questions. We've got a few more minutes before the end of the session. Were there any kind of closing thoughts that you had with regard to the regime and perhaps potential changes going forward? No, I think, I mean, we do know that there is a consultation paper coming out and expected further diagnostic work. We thought the consultation paper may be out. It's due this month, so we thought it may actually have come out earlier this month. If not, then it's very likely that it will be, you know, in the next couple, well, it's going to be in the next couple of weeks because they said it's coming out this month. So I think there's going to be a bit of a scramble because I think most people on this call will know that when the FCA issues a consultation paper, there are not often very significant changes between the consultation paper and the final rules. So I think that in the next couple of weeks, we're going to see what the FCA is intending, and we will all have to start preparing for that likely eventuality. So that's it, yeah. Thank you. Well, Kenneth, absolutely fascinating again, really insightful. There was a lot of information that you've imparted there, but as you kindly suggested, you are making available the slide deck for our participants, which we will send out post-event. So that just leaves me to say thank you again for your time and work that you undertake to put these briefings together for us. I'd like to thank our participants for joining us today. Again, I know it's an hour out of your day, but hopefully you'll find that it was very valuable. And if you could leave your feedback with the feedback survey when you receive that post-event. And just leaves me to wish you a very good afternoon. Thank you very much.
Thanks, everyone.